Yeah, we have a winter storm coming. It's not here yet, but it's blowing out there and it's cold. And the ground is now frozen. And that means snow will stick. Hauled a little bit of firewood with this and was running one of the junk pile 572s for a little bit. It was kind of interesting. I had the fellow who's been buying firewood run the Husqvarna. It's in here somewhere. And then he has a 575 that I'd put together. Here's the Husqvarna. And then he ran the 572. And so I let him put some time on him. Then I asked him, I said, what do you think? And he thought the 575 and the 572 were nice. He liked them because they didn't vibrate much and they made decent power. He liked the 572 because it had more RPMs on the smaller wood. I get that. So I asked him about the Husqvarna because he wasn't saying nothing. Yeah, it's okay. He goes, it just needs more power. And it doesn't rev. So it's kind of hard for a person who may not be quite as chainsaw savvy as the folks, listening to this channel. He's run chainsaws all his life. So that's just raw impressions. It's not that he doesn't like the Husqvarna. It's just he likes the 572 and the 575 better. That's just feedback. I'm deciding whether or not I get another one of these and build it for speed, power, so there's a side-by-side comparison. Or do I save my money and just go into that one and do what I used to do with 372s and see if we can't get it to pick up RPMs and run with the mostly stock. That one over there is mostly stock 572. So that's a potential project, but I kind of want to get away from that for a little bit. Just let them be. They're working. They're cutting. I have to do more wood, both firewood and logs. And I'm going to probably put a chain on the 572 and start felling with it. I want to see if I can. That one there has just got a minor compression increase, no muffler mod, nothing else, and something anyone can do. So I was thinking maybe I'll run that felling and see if it does a good enough job, because that's pretty close to stock. You know what I'm saying? My built 572 is a wonderful felling saw. It does not vibrate. It's an easy starter. I had to drill out the decomp a little bit so it was easier for me to pull over. But auto tune means I never have to touch it with a screwdriver. Just fire up and go. And it's pretty fuel efficient now that it broke in. When I first built it, I was a little disappointed because it was sucking down the fuel, but it seems like once it broke in, it was fine. Now, I've got two built that way. Then I've got this one sort of halfway. And then I've got one I've left pretty much stock from the junk piles. And all four of them will smoke the poor little Husqvarna. Different class saws. But I want to go somewhere else. I've put a lot of time into the 572s, the G395, stuff like that. My vintage saws, the Husqvarna 285, which is a monster. The Husqvarnas that I had worked with, like the G395, that thing was a surprise. This one here really isn't, but it's a decent saw for, $350. My Homelite, that was a big surprise. But I need to change gears a little bit, and I'm thinking about what I would consider the forgotten saw from Husqvarna, and maybe I'll build it into a felling saw for this late fall, early winter. And that would be the 385, 390 series. And this is what I consider one of the better saws that Husqvarna had sold. And I guess the John's Thread equivalent would be the 2186 and 2188. And the big difference between the 385 and the 390 was the bore. There was a bunch of other differences, but that was what a lot of people, would see as the biggest difference. This is the 385 top end. It's a new old stock top end. And this would be a 390. A little bit larger bore. This one happens to be a Meteor. And I believe they're 55 millimeters. And it was a good saw. I would say the best way to describe a 385 is just a big giant 372. Got another top end around. And they were, for their time, a screamer. Decent power, a lot of RPMs. And there are those who would say that the 385 had the perfect port timing for a chainsaw. Modifying one was about compression and maybe making things go wider, but not changing the timing that much, because they just made good power, good RPMs. But they had issues. And Husqvarna did what they always do. They addressed them over time. Yeah, see, this is a 390 top end, 55 millimeter. And one of the things that they had problems with was bearings and cranks. Like this one right here. Took out that rod bearing. Partly because they just spun. They spun a lot of RPMs. So they went from a 385, and they made some changes, and went to the 390, which had less issues than the 385. And I'm not sure if it was balance or change in supply or whatever. The bearings in the 390 lasted a lot longer than the 385s did. At least that's the rumor. Because I have a whole pile of 385 cases with bearings beat up and broken cranks. High RPM saw. But some of the other changes that happened over time was Husky actually came out with a completely different crank and rod assembly. And that's what they currently use. So they've definitely upgraded the bottom ends. Some of the other issues I saw with the 390s was they had different boots. And it's not unusual to see a 390 with a white dot on the intake boot and have that thing split. And the yellow dots seem to do a lot better. I mean, little things like that. But in general, it was a solid saw, And obviously the 385, 390 was a fairly long running model. And they got replaced by the 592, 585 series. So they're no longer being sold, I'm sure there's some dealers who still have a few around. But it was, in my mind, the premier logging saw for Husqvarna during that period of time. They sold them in the 2000s. And in my mind, I'm not really sure if the 585, 592 is significantly better as a pro saw. And they're certainly more powerful. The 592 is going to smoke a 390, no doubt. But I'm just talking about life with a saw, the simplicity, long-term reliability, stuff like that. And I'm going to explore that a little bit because we're going to build these. I don't know if I'm going to build one or two. I think I want to build one 385 and then one with a 390 top end. Work my way through that. And then, yeah, of course, the simplistic judge on a saw is how fast does it cut a cookie. We'll do some of that. I can tell you that a 390 or a 385 cuts fast enough. But that's not really in my mind, the true measure of a successful build. It's just one of many. And I just want to spend time with it. And maybe this year, I'm hoping this year I can spend time with a 385 or a 390 side by side with the 585 and just kind of live with them for a little bit. And while I still can, and kind of come up with an analysis. So now they've gone through a lot of evolutions. We're going to discuss some of those. But I just want to point out yet again that the biggest difference between the 385 and the 390 is bore. And now the bottom ends have been significantly upgraded. So a lot of the guys who had bad taste from the 385s and what they did or didn't do, these new bottom ends are a significant upgrade over what they had before. Now to this project, here's the question. I've got a new old stock 385 top end. Right? You can see there's a difference between the bore. That's a 390 next to it. It doesn't tell me what the... Yeah, I think it's 54 millimeter. This is a Melee. And this is a Meteor. Meteor is a fairly well-regarded company. But you can already see there's some differences between the quality. Just look at the way the casting is right there at the bottom of the transfers versus those squared off things. So while the Meteor is certainly a worthy replacement, I would say that the Melee is a better top end if you can get your hands on one. And no, mine's not for sale. I'm thinking I'll put this top end on that new bottom end, and that would be the best of both worlds for me. But we'll see. But let's continue to look. The Melees have always had a little bit different color to their castings. And I'm pretty sure it's because they have a proprietary mix, you know, for their aluminum. Yeah, look at that. This looks like a better, tighter grained casting than this one right here. So I would say that the stock piston is also better than the aftermarket one. My God, that looks like something from Highway or something like that. You know? When I pull this off, I'm going to really look at it closely. See, it got beat up on the top because once the rod bearing let loose, it started hitting the top of the cylinder. Killed the cylinder. So I'm not going to be able to use the cylinder that came off of this saw. Now there's other things that are very similar between a 385, 390, and 372. The layout, if you weren't really, you know, familiar with the two saws, they look almost identical. The way the flywheel is, ignition, you know, bar oil location, the handle, the gas tank handle. But obviously you got the inserts on the 390, 385 series that you don't have on the 372, and also the 390, 385 has got the 4 clips on the top instead of 2 because it's a little bit bigger, right? Clutch, chain brake, that all looks pretty much the same, you know, buck and spike. A lot of this stuff, by the way, is interchangeable with 372. And things like side covers are definitely interchangeable between the two saws. So I'm going to put a later side cover on my hybrid saw here when I'm done. But the 385, 390 series has a larger bearing than the 372. And on the PTO side, we'll get into that, it has an integral seal instead of the 2-piece seal that the 372s had. Details, details. as I was saying earlier in the video, the bearings are different on the 385, 390 than the 372 with the integral seal. Another little detail is when you build these things, now I had done a puller to make sure that this came out right. These bearings have to go back about 50 thousandths. See that how it's protruded by about 50 thousandths? Close to flush on the inside, but it's going to pop out about 50 thousandths on the outside. And that confuses some people. Now what I had done, if I can find it, I have a basically it's like a bushing that I put on my puller that'll pull the bearing into the bushing that has a recess 50 thousandths to make sure it's positioned properly. Little details. But yeah, I think I got bones. And here's the other side. Interestingly enough, that one has a nylon caged bearing in this one here. And it's a 390. I believe this one is 2, but you can't, yeah, it's a nylon caged. So I think I can probably clean up these bearings and use them. I don't think they've been destroyed. And we'll see. I think I'm going to buy an aftermarket crank. I know I have another crank laying around somewhere, but I think I want to try with this build right here, those cases with an aftermarket crank with a Meteor top end, and that might be the foil against my OEM, all OEM 385 build with new old stock, short block and top end. Let's start picking over the bones. What do I got in here? Oh, mufflers are interchangeable. Look at that. I think we're going to do a muffler mod. That's a nice looking muffler right there. Yeah, I think that one's wasted. Flywheel, I believe they interchange. You can jam a 385, 390 chain brake handle on a 372, but it doesn't really fit right. It's not right. But a lot of this other stuff does. Interesting. See, I wonder why that's jammed in there. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Now the ignitions are not the same. The 385, 390, well the 390s, 385s, they let them spin. They rev limited those to 13,000. I may get an X-Torque ignition and put it on that one. I'll look at that. Bet that interchanges. So there's just a lot of stuff that will interchange. Yeah, this was the problem area. Yeah, see how brittle that is? I'm going to have to replace that. And I need to get a yellow dot. It's interesting. Whoever built this, they may have created their own problem. Because the little steel ring insert was on the wrong part. See if I can find that again. See that right there? That ring was supposed to be in there, and it was not, which means it was sucking air for sure. See that? I bet that's what killed this saw. So we got lots of stuff in here, you know. Don't know if I have enough to do a complete build right now, but I think what I want to do is just start picking through what I have here and seeing if I can piece together enough for a build. Well, the 390s, they were a good solid logging saw. They were a little bit boring, I think. But my God, there's been a lot of timber taken down by 390s over the years. Good solid saw. And like I said, the last iterations, Husqvarna does what they always do. Had that, crank and connecting rod. With that, I think I'm going to make this a short video as the beginning of a project. I know right off the bat I got to go dig out my box of 390 parts and find the yellow dot intake boot. That's the first thing I got to do. The second thing I got to do, see, I'm moving my shop. I'm mostly moved out of here. Most of it is up on the hill already, but somewhere in that mix I've got boxes of 390 parts, top ends and cases and stuff like that. I've got a built case. I got to find it, and so I can have two cases to work from as I build the next, junk pile felon saw. By the way, happy Thanksgiving. Weather's not cooperating, so it's a perfect day to start digging through the pile to come up with stuff. Here's one of the boxes. Let me go dig through that. We got another box over here. So we've been moving stuff, so it's all jumbled up. But anyway, happy Thanksgiving, and I think the next video will be going through and making sure I've got the bits and pieces to build one of these things. Yeah, and a couple other little projects is I've got to sharpen up this chain. It's pretty beat. Been cutting a lot of firewood, and I let the firewood guy run it for a couple of tanks. And the other thing is I usually put these on the 372 mufflers right there. That in addition to the stock outlets quite a bit. But I think I'm going to put that on the Husqvarna one. Because the guy who was running it for firewood says he wants it loud. So, yeah, I don't know if it's going to make a difference having it that much more open, but it will be loud. So I think I'm going to put together a muffler mod too. So I have a few little tactical things I need to do while I'm down here before I roll into that 385, 390 project. So I got to sharpen this one right here. And check out that old Oregon VersaCut. I think it's got a little time on it. And this is the C83. Nice gold link right there so you know where to start and stop. But they've got a very sophisticated grind on those teeth. And it's going to be a little tough to replicate that with just a round file. But we'll make it work. And last but not least, I had watched a video this week from somebody who I have a lot of respect for. And they're getting into the 562. I guess they're doing a build for a guy. And basically laid out a lot of reasons why he didn't like working on them. And it made me a little sad. Because what it demonstrates is the really good builders who grew up doing steels during the 90s into the 2000s, developed their craft on a very simple design. But a couple of the issues with modifying these is based on the fact that the cylinder's at a pretty steep angle. So when you drop that cylinder, both the exhaust is harder to match up, but also the intake, because it's further down and the attachment points are now different. And on the muffler, it's pretty easy. Just use a reamer on the top to sort of re-angle them a little bit. But the intake, you do have to, really think about it. It's harder to do. So doing things like big changes to carburation, stuff like that. Yeah, I guess you can, I suppose. It's just a lot harder. And I would say two things. One, there's a point of diminishing returns by doing that. And second is a squish band on these things. Stock is actually pretty good. So doing other things to change the shape of the combustion chamber to get better compression is probably a better choice than trying to hack the cylinder. And plus, I mean, how much do you really want to take off the flanges on these? But you know, it's kind of a derivative. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Where, again, old style building saws really has the roots way back in the 60s almost, and 70s. The technology really was derived from, just simple two-stroke theory. Increase the compression, get a lot of gas and air through it, and you make more horsepower. Well, these saws here, they've gone to a little more sophisticated design, and it's about efficiency, fuel usage, and emissions. And the design that the engineers came up with is pretty complex, and they have been able to do more with less. And what I mean by that is smaller intake, smaller carburetor, smaller cross-section on the transfers are getting the same kinds of power that some of the old timers would get with these massive transfer ports and stuff like that. You're still not going to beat bigger carburetor means more power, because ultimately making horsepower is about burning fuel and air, right? The more you can get in, the more you have a chance of making more power. So the big giant carburetors and big giant ports and stuff like that, theoretically, you have more material that's a burnable material, therefore you should have more potential energy, assuming you can get the efficiency right. And what these guys have done is something a little bit different, is they've focused very much on the efficiency of the mix that's actually in the saw. And also taking advantage of some physics in order to get, more flow through those little tiny holes. Using the heat from the exhaust, for example, to accelerate the gases up those transfers. Get better scavenging, more efficiency. And the basic design is just very sophisticated stuff. It's hard to out-engineer these engineers. So my approach on these has been different. Is I concede right up front that I'm not going to change the carburetor. But I also recognize up front that it's a damn nice saw stock. It's a really nice saw. The things that I want to get out of this saw over and above stock really don't require big giant carburetors and stuff like that. I'm not really requiring that at all. I want more punch in the bottom. So really it's about making the lower part of the RPM range a little stronger. And that's easy. That's, compression, stuff like that. So that's what I've done, is I've focused on a little more intake duration, a little more compression, and also getting heat out of the motor. I did that early on with the 562s because I used to run hot. And get the heat out, and the net was, it seems like I get a little more power. Now, I didn't do the exhaust with the idea of getting more power. I did the exhaust with the idea of trying to cool these things off. But, over the years, what I've done was I'd take a common service tool, and I had it, and I'd make a change, and I'd take a look at the operating history, for example. And when I would see the numbers on the fuel settings change, I would relate that to the changes I made into the saw. Figured out a couple of things. Again, more air and fuel means more power. So I would try to keep my builds so that they weren't overextending the carburetor's ability to supply fuel. So I was looking for numbers over 40. When the operating history started showing numbers under 40 on the high speed and on the low speed, then I was taking the approach that I had gone too far. So I'd back off that particular mod. And that was usually about porting. And so I, over the years, I came up with a blend on the 562s and now 572s where, there's more power on top. And it could be a variety of reasons, probably the muffler. But I've significantly increased the torque, or the punch, right off idle. And that was what I was shooting for with the 572s. And I took the same approach that I had done with the 562s when I was trying to get them to run like a 372. It's kind of confusing. But the point is, you have to play the cards you're dealt. And the stock saw as it is so close to what I would want anyway. It's more a matter of adjusting the power band versus turning it into a hot saw, because they come from the factory really, really good. And I'm sure that's going to annoy the crap out of a lot of builders. They're pretty good stock. So as I said, I went about taking a section of the power band and trying to increase it, because I was looking for more punch, more torque right off throttle. And that was the approach I've done now since probably 2014. But anyway, I like my 572s. I really do. My tweaked ones are a lot better for me than stock. And the configuration for me is not just the motor. That's what everyone wants to focus on. They want to see a lot of chips and grinding and stuff like that. For me, it's everything from the handle to the buck and spike, bar chain combo, and then having a little more punch to have the power band more suited for what I do. I think that's another point. And I'm not quite sure how to get into it, but at some point I need to quantify it. Is a lot of these higher RPM saws, just like the old higher RPM saws, like a 242 or something like that, you'd fry the bearings if they spent all their time on the rev limiter. Well, these are no different. So when you see these guys, or when you see, a person has one of these and the bar and chain combo doesn't pull the motor down into the power band, and all you hear it do is bouncing off the rev limiters, that little rattle on top. Why is anyone surprised that those guys end up with fried bearings? And it's a hard subject, because you really can't say that, because you'll hurt somebody's pride. But a person who, say, grew up on, say, 288s and went into 390s, which is another subject, the 385 had the ability of cranking more RPMs than a 390. So what did Husqvarna do? Is they rev limited the ignition to 13,000 instead of letting it go to 13.5. There's your clue. Well, these things here, they'll turn 14. So part of the operation and part of the setup in order to have a long-lasting saw such as this one right here, or a 562, is to get enough bar and chain to actually load that motor, so it doesn't overpower it and just bounce off the rev limiter all the time, which is a path to a blown up bottom end. Of course, they'll blame the saw. In my mind, that's a subject that needs to be discussed a little more, which I never hear anyone talk about. And that's really setting up the saw to get the work done you need done, but also to keep the saw in its sweet spot to where it is designed to work. If you do limit all the time, you don't want a 572 with a short bar. Get yourself a 550. Something where the power and the size of the saw and the bar are matched to the work. So it's not just, I guess, setup. It's a matter of choosing the right tool for the job, but then also getting a setup to where the saw works within its design parameters, which I think is a subject for another video. So anyway, I think I'm going to cut this one off. Now let's see if I got it between the two trees. And I did. Perfect.